Our first speaker is Lorraine Whitmarsh. And Professor Whitmarsh, she's from the University of Bath and the Center of Climate Change and Societal Transformations, CAST Center. So yeah, welcome Lorraine, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, social transformations, you were so close. Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to be here. And I had the great privilege of examining Shinran's PhD. And also, then it was a really nice opportunity this morning to talk about some related work that we've been doing, actually. Because over the last several years, I've been collaborating with Sam Hampton, a research fellow in our group, on the idea of carbon capability, which really captures this idea that people have multiple roles and contexts in which they can take action. So it really links nicely with what Shinran's been doing. So I guess to situate this, of course, I probably don't need to convince you that behaviour matters to tackle climate change. 2/3 of emissions come from households, and some households emit more than others, particularly high-income households. And so it matters to understand at the individual and household level what drives consumption, what causes emissions, and how we can change behaviour. What's emerged in the literature, though, is what I would say is quite an unhelpful binary between system change versus individual change. And so we've had papers talking about the I frame versus S frame. And while it does kind of point to different ways of seeing the problem and different emphases within policy, it does sort of suggest that these are kind of two absolute categories and it's either or. And that's unhelpful because we know really that both agency and structure together are elements of what forms social change, social transformation. And that yes, absolutely systems or structures shape and limit what people can do. And so there are definitely, as Shinran's work has shown, people do recognise that there are constraints on what actions that they can take. But individuals do exert some agency, and some have more agency or influence than others. And crucially, individuals and groups can shape systems through the different roles that they have, for example, as investors, professionals, as consumers. So the work of Christian Nielsen particularly highlights the ways in which people can exert influence on society and on systems through these different roles. But in the work that I've been doing with Sam, what we've been doing is picking up and developing this carbon capability framework as a slightly different lens through which we've been understanding the different contexts for actions. And so it draws on the capability approach by Sen and others, the social practice theory by Chauve and others, this idea of kind of structure, agency, integration, and various other kind of ideas from the literature. And it recognises that there is a spectrum from agency to structure, but that actually if we're interested in climate actions, you can kind of situate them between those and sort of see them as a product of these two sort of ends of the structuration axis coming together and being kind of almost co-produced through these relationships. And so we identified 6 broad domains of climate action that you can maybe just make out here, but I will zoom in on the next slide. So 4 of these domains are direct emission domains, so food, energy, transport, and shopping. And so within the circle, you might be able to make out some examples of those behaviours, like avoiding flying, buying secondhand, buying seasonal goods, and so on. And so these are things that we're quite familiar from the literature on changing behaviour, because this is where actually quite a lot of the focus has been, at least within environmental psychology, in what we can do to change behaviour. The other 2 domains we identified were influence and citizenship. And so influence, it includes kind of things like having a conversation about climate change, or what sort of career you might choose, or getting involved in community action and so on. Citizenship is the more political engagement, so voting, protesting, and so on. Interestingly, actually, I feel like professional decision-making kind of maybe sits a little bit sort of, it's not totally spelled out, but I would say probably within the influence category. because we've got kind of career choices there. And so through the influence that we have within the workplace, I think we would position it there. But these two bottom categories here, influence and citizenship, are really where we might indirectly engage in emission reductions through shaping systems, through influencing other people, organisations, society as a whole, versus the top four, which are more about reducing our own emissions directly. So we wanted to kind of really broaden the scope of thinking about what climate action actually is beyond the consumer role. And we've done kind of a number of surveys and various other things to try to dig into, well, what are people doing within these different categories? This figure comes from a paper that we published a couple of years ago, which integrates two data sets. One that we collected, some survey data that we collected in 2008, and a more recent survey in 2022 with a UK sample. The most recent one was a sample of about 2,000 people. And you can see the darker bars are the more recent data, but actually the proportions reporting doing these various climate actions are not dissimilar between those 2 years. So things haven't changed a great deal. They've gone up a little bit in a few cases. But what the other thing to notice, other than the sort of lack of very significant change over time, is that we really see a very strong bias towards the low impact, kind of consumer focused actions, as other people have also found. So everybody recycles, but things like changing diet, reducing flying, less prevalent, and in particular the political actions. People are taking very little action to engage in protests or writing to a politician. And we know similar findings from other studies as well in other countries. In our latest work, and this was actually together with a student called Alyssa Gura, what we did was actually try to go beyond just self-reported behaviours, which is what I've just shown, to actually try to develop a more robust measure of carbon capability that draws in a whole range of different items. It's still particularly relying on survey data. But what we were able to do was to, first of all, measure people's carbon footprint. So through a number of items in the survey, we use kind of carbon calculators to essentially calculate the average carbon footprint, which comes out as about 10 tonnes of CO2 in the UK. Where we need to be, incidentally, if we're to reach a 1.5 degree warming limit, is something like 1.5 tonnes by 2035. So we have a huge way to go if we are to effectively reduce emissions. But you can see that transport contributes about half of people's carbon footprint, and then food is the next largest proportion. But the survey also included a whole range of other measures that were captured attitudes, knowledge, skills, engagement with kind of wider structures, perceptions of constraints and social norms, as well as other self-reported actions that they were taking beyond emission reductions, that enabled us to actually calculate a carbon capability score across the different domains we're interested in. And you can see on the right what that score came out as, the average scores. So you can see that actually, despite transport accounting for the biggest proportion of carbon footprint, actually energy is where people are reporting doing more and actually saying that they can do more, so that there are fewer constraints on them saving energy, installing energy efficiency devices and so on. Shopping is next highest, but then again we see citizenship and influence really being the lowest levels of capability. So people just reporting that they're not doing this, but also that they just don't feel that they could or would want to do that, so that there are constraints and also a lack of willingness, I think, in many cases. So there's a huge amount of detail that I don't have time to really go into, but the paper really dissects how we measured all these things. And it's really trying to kind of, I guess, provide a bigger picture, a more comprehensive picture of these different areas of action. And so why do we get this very strong bias towards everybody recycles, but most people are not doing the things that would really make a big difference to reducing their carbon emissions, which includes changing their travel habits, for example, changing their diet and so on. So part of this is to do with misperceptions of environmental impact. So on the right here, you see a figure that comes from some polling that we were involved with, that Ipsos did, a really large sample of over 20,000 people, where they were asking people, which of these things do you think would reduce emissions by individuals living in richer countries? So they were essentially looking at kind of where do people think effective climate action sits? And you can see that most people think that recycling is the most effective, followed by renewable energy, etc. And so some of the things that fall sort of towards the top are relatively effective, because if you look at the amount of CO2 saved, some of those things are quite effective. Incidentally, we included having one fewer child because that comes from the Kimberly-Nicholas paper where they calculated emissions that we got this from. So that was on the list, even though that arguably controversial. And so people do not see that as being very effective, whereas that original paper said that was the most effective thing you could do. But it is really stark that essentially people massively overestimate the effectiveness of recycling and tend to underestimate a lot of other things. And they're particularly, there's really low awareness of having a plant-based diet and the benefits that can have. So that's part of the reason why I think we have this skew. Another part is to do with pluralistic ignorance, which is the idea that basically we underestimate wider public support for climate action. So people don't know that other people are concerned and taking action. And so that might be why we see a bit of a disparity in terms of people's concern about climate change versus their actual behaviour. But I really think a really big part of it is to do with the structural constraints that people experience, the fact that it costs more, that it can be inconvenient, that there are availability limitations to some of these lower carbon options. And in a review paper that we published, we kind of tried to gather together all the evidence on what influences climate action across these different domains. And of course, you know this from other studies, but it spans things like habits, skills, attitudes, so things at the individual level. And we've particularly been interested in habits as a big barrier to behaviour change, because we know that in the presence of habits, information provision, for example, is particularly ineffective. Social influences like norms, peer expectations and so on, and particularly that's relevant for things like food choices. Physical influences, things like transport systems, urban design, certainly particularly relevant for travel choices. And then political factors, so regulations, pricing, governance arrangements, a whole range of things come in there. So an overview of the sorts of things that shape our choices, but you can really see that while they do vary across the areas that we're interested in, there are some big barriers to changing behaviour. Coming back to the paper that I showed a minute ago in terms of the sort of the calculating carbon capability, in that paper we also looked at what predicted these carbon capability and carbon footprint scores. And essentially you can see that, as you would expect, so the two colours there, the lighter one is carbon footprint. So women have a lower carbon footprint, people with more climate knowledge have a lower carbon footprint, whereas there is, if you look on the right-hand side, by far the biggest positive predictor is income. So as we know from other literature, higher income groups have a much bigger carbon footprint. But also if we look at the capability score, which was this wider measure that captured lots of other things, we see, kind of broadly speaking, things move in the other direction. So women report having higher capability. If you have a high level of education, you're more capable. And climate knowledge makes a difference as well. So a range of demographic, thank you, demographic, but also knowledge factors play a role. So what works to change behaviour? So I just like this very simple typology of downstream versus upstream. There are iterations of downstream, midstream, upstream. But from the original Verplanken and Wood classification, downstream is where you're influencing individuals' choices directly, usually information provision, education, but also maybe social influence comes in here. upstream approaches are where you're influencing the context of action, the situation. And so here you've got a range of things like economic measures, changing the availability of products and services, either through nudging, where you're changing choice architecture, or regulating, and changes to the physical and built environment as well come in here. And what's really interesting from various meta-analyses and studies is the fact that downstream measures by themselves are really ineffective at changing behaviour. So a meta-analysis by Neisser et al. Found that information provision was only 2 to 3% effective in changing climate-relevant behaviours. Whereas in that particular study, they found that nudging was 25% effective on average. And then you could say, like, depending on if you're talking about regulating altogether, that maybe that could be up to 100% effective if you're actually removing an option altogether. So upstream measures are more effective. Now, the caveat, I guess, is that actually, if we're interested in not just direct emission reductions, so those sort of consumer actions that I've talked about, but also building support for wider social and political and structural change, of course, information is a big part of that. So we do need to engage people in a conversation, get them involved in decision-making about how to tackle climate change, and information will help build support for that wider change. But it will not by itself generally be very effective in actually getting people to change their behaviour to reduce emissions. The good news is, from, again, lots of polling that we've done with Ipsos, is that broadly speaking, there is quite a lot of public support for these sort of upstream policies that would enable people to change their behaviour. We have done several waves of polling now over the last few years, looking at support for things like frequent flyer levies, which is where you would pay more tax per flight that you take each year, through to electric vehicle subsidies and higher taxes on red meat and dairy. And even that one, which is quite a controversial measure, we tend to see more support than opposition to those measures. I just have maybe a minute or two to finish by saying the other sort of bit of work that we've done is to actually disaggregate carbon capability across different groups, look at how carbon capability varies by different sorts of factors. One of the papers that we've published is on wealthy people. So here we did a UK survey of about 1,000 people, where we separated out the group that were in the top decile of income. We did 16 depth interviews with wealthy people that fell into that category as well. And really, again, to distill a lot of information, what came out of that was that these people have really high carbon footprints, as we would expect. So the top figure there shows they're spending more on health and beauty products, on disposable items, they're taking more flights, and they, both for leisure and for work. And they kind of normalise that. So the qualitative data really showed that they say, I don't enjoy buying secondhand. It doesn't give me that dopamine hit of having an expensive purchase. Or talking about the amount of travel they're doing. I'm going to Rome next Saturday, a week on Monday, I'm trying to the US, go to Malta for 2 weeks. So they're flying all over the place. And the flying is the thing that they will not change. So when we talked about kind of what are the areas that you'd be willing to change, flying was the one that they absolutely will not curb. And this came out of when we were looking at support for climate policies. They do support a lot of climate policies, except anything that was about curbing flying. They are, however, adopting low carbon technologies, which of course tend to be more expensive. So they are already and more willing to purchase a heat pump, purchase an electric vehicle. So they play an important role in terms of being early adopters of those technologies that then subsequently become more affordable for the rest of the public. And they, of course, more often than not, have quite senior professional roles that enable them to have influence within the workplace. Okay, so that came out as quite an important area where they actually do have quite a lot of carbon capability. The other group that we've published on is parents. And so here again, from mixed methods survey and interviews and focus groups, we found that parenthood was associated with increased energy consumption, transport use, plastic waste. So their direct emissions go up. While it can be kind of uncomfortable maybe talking to other adults about climate change, they clearly recognise that they had an influence on their children in terms of modelling low carbon behaviours. And so, yeah, if they're like a blank canvas, if they see you litter, they will litter. They eat what you eat, etc. And they were slightly more supportive of climate policies than non-parents. So bringing all this together then, essentially what we've been trying to do is to try to, again, like a bit like Jinran really, move beyond the consumer focus to think about these other roles and contexts of action that people have. And also to kind of break down the idea of climate action through this carbon capability framework to provide a more nuanced view of what people's actions comprise, what influences them, and to shed light on this influence and citizenship set of actions in particular. What our evidence shows, in line with other studies, is that we absolutely need more upstream interventions if we're going to change behaviour. We do need more participatory designs, give people a stronger say in shaping systems, because they do have strong views. And we know from other studies that if we don't involve people, there could be backlash or resistance. And another key insight is that there are key moments of change as well, like becoming a parent or maybe being promoted and to a more senior position within work, where there are real opportunities to reshape habits and influence key decisions that people might be making. So we've got lots of papers that I recommend that you have a look at. And just before I go, I have to advertise the fact that we have a new journal. The first issue was published last week. Linda is on the editorial board. So yeah, if you're looking for an outlet for your research, please do consider environmental psychology research. It's great. So, thank you.